We are in a global pandemic. Our churches are closed and are therefore deemed non-essential by the governments. In the face of death and division, America is on the verge of imploding. There is a new arms race and a sense of an urgent conversion to God. God has sent His prophets to prepare us for these times, and as a sign of His greatest mercy and love, He sends His mother repeatedly to help us to find Him in this chaotic world. But many are still deaf and blind to the signs of these end times. There is much confusion, division, fear, with the countless distractions before us every minute of every day. We have been told of a time of the two popes. We have been told of the final battle between the church, family and marriage against Jesus Christ and the AntiChrist. Is it a coincidence, therefore, to see these exact things unfold as we enter the 40th year of Medjugorje? Is it a coincidence that the new message of Akita coincided with the Amazon Synod and the false worship of idols? Is it a coincidence that we are at the last pope in the list of Saint Malachy? Is it fitting to see modern day Ireland in comparison to the silent apparition of naught? So many things are now coming together rapidly, and like millions of people around the world, I sense the nearing of the Garabandal warning and the unfolding of the Medjugorje secrets more now than ever. To help us understand this decisive time, Lucia of Fatima told us to look at the book of Revelation between chapters 8 through 13. The Holy Mother will help us understand why the book of the Apocalypse is that decisive battle over Christ and His Church against the Antichrist and the Anti-Church in this modern world. So let us begin. Although some apparitions occurred in previous centuries, they did point to our times. Apart from the others in our times, we also have prophecies and visions from some of the most famous and gifted mystics of the Church. And in this case, we're looking at quickly at Catherine Emmerich and Padre Pio. It all points to our time, as we will see shortly. These times concern the world and the Catholic Church. If you are a member of one of the tens of thousands of different denominations, or even maybe you're of no denomination, I still urge you to watch this video. The Bible, the tradition of the Church, and these apparitions will highlight a simple and trustworthy understanding. We start with the beast. Here in Apocalypse 13 verses 1 through 2, John writes, I saw a beast, having 7 heads and 10 horns, like a leopard, and his feet were the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. This echoes a description given centuries ago previously with the prophet Daniel. And 4 great beasts. First was like a lioness, another beast like a bear, another like a leopard. A 4th beast had 10 horns. The 4 beasts that Daniel saw are incorporated into one in the Apocalypse. What does this represent? There are various takes, but we know the 4 beasts in Daniel represented 4 separate kingdoms. First the Babylonian Empire, then the Medo-Persian Empire, then the Greek, and finally the Roman Empire. And now in the book of the Apocalypse, they all form part of the one beast. Church fathers said that this represents the Antichrist, and it was Pope Pius X said that the Antichrist and modernism are the synthesis of all heresies. In the beast there is a bringing together of all evils of the empires, which in their own time persecuted those of God. It is easy to suggest that the incorporation of multiple empires into one is the nearing of a one world government. But before getting carried away with the thoughts and suggestions to add up in the multitude of many already out there, let's quickly go through the main points and comparisons between Christ and the Antichrist, between the Church and the Anti-Church in this modern world, and see what Our Lady is preparing us for. The bottom picture is St John writing the Apocalypse, and it is the devil who is empowering the Antichrist. The devil is the dragon, and the Antichrist is the incorporation of the beasts. The beast, the Antichrist, will wage war on the saints for 42 months, 2 witnesses preaching at the same time, which is 3.5 years. We can conclude from the Apocalypse at the beginning of chapter 13, the beast comes from the sea, which is the symbol of the world. The Antichrist will fake rising from the dead. The 7 heads are 7 kings before the Antichrist. The 10 horns are the 10 kings, and if you always look closely to the Old Testament, it incorporates the beasts into one in the book of Revelation. The Antichrist tries to mock, reverse, or distort the praise given to the Lamb for himself. It is the evil imitating Christ. But here are a few quick comparisons of that mockery, of that false imitation. We read in Apocalypse chapter 5 that the Lamb was with 7 horns, 7 meaning not that eternal realm of God, completion. The first beast has 7 heads like a lamb. Who is worthy to open the book? Who is like the beast? Again, comparisons. The 24 ancients adored the Lamb, and later all the earth adored the beast. The Lamb redeemed the people of every tribe, tongue, nation, of people and nation. Power is given to the beast over every tribe, tongue, people and nation. Those written in the book of life of the Lamb enter heaven, and those written in the book of the life of those not written in the book of the life of the Lamb adore the beast. It's our baptism that has sealed us with the mark of the Lamb. We are the children of God. We just need to stay under the power of the Lamb, the Lord, when the war is waged upon us. And is that war here? Is it still to come? We'll shortly find out. Again, just a few more comparisons. The 2 witnesses slay by fire. The second beast brings fire from heaven. Witnesses stood before the Lord. Second beast acts in the sight of the first beast. And the breath of life animates witnesses. The second beast gives life to the image. Now the word image comes in quite a bit, and you'll see as it comes closer to false worship. The beast from the sea was the Roman persecution. It was part of, speaking of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. The power of the beast, which had 7 heads, are the 7 Caesars. Reigning at the time was Nero. The second beast from land, which had some likeness to the Lamb. This is in fact the Jewish persecution of the church. Remember, the Israelites inherited the promised land. 40 years in the desert, they finally entered the promised land. Remember when the Jews supported the first beast, the Roman Empire, when they declared on the tribunal of Christ that they had no king but Caesar, and thus were agents in persecuting Jesus to death and also persecuting the early Christian followers, the early Christian church. So these things have already came, but like many prophecies, they do have a fourfold meaning. Now what we're going on to here is the mark of the beast, which seems to be a more prevalent thing in these days, especially with the pandemic and everything going on. But remember, the devil imitates and mocks everything of God. So here in Apocalypse 13 verse 16, he shall make all, both little and great, rich and poor, free men and bondmen, to have a character in their right hand or on their foreheads. But something already came before this, and it was in Apocalypse chapter 7 verse 3. The servants of God were signed on their foreheads. So the servants of God are already signed. What does this mean? It still points to the first thing of baptism. Do you remember earlier in the Apocalypse where the servants were marked? Anything strange like this that you would wonder what does it mean will always have its roots found in the New Testament. The servants of God, therefore, having their foreheads signed, it's something from the Old Testament, specifically Exodus 13 verse 9 and verse 16. Now the reason they're put in this way is for, you'll see in the next slide, a character on their right hand or on their foreheads, and it shall be a sign in thy hand as a memorial before thy eyes. Now something about the memorial, do this in memory of me, hint hint, as a memorial before thy eyes. Now, what if you actually find out, you always go back to the point where here we're looking at the Jewish rabbis. Now, if you know anything, again, our Christian faith comes back from the Jews themselves. It's the whole point of salvation history in the Bible. But what's this thing round the arm and hand? What's this thing on the forehead? Now, without getting tongue-tied, it's called phylacteries. This is the scribes and the Pharisees when it comes to the time of Jesus. This is where we'll see more and more how these things are liturgical worships, where you have your mind and your heart, your labour, everything focused on the Lord. It was even still in the time of Jesus that these ancient practices, going back to the Old Testament, were still in place. As Jesus says in Matthew 23 verse 5, and all works they do for to be seen for men, for they make their phylacteries broad and enlarge their fringes. Basically the pride of the rabbis, look at me, look what I'm doing, all about pride, intellectual pride, clerical pride, control. And what this was known as the Shema. And if you go back to Deuteronomy, you'll see here in chapter 6 there's a couple of verses that stands out. The Jews focus in on the Shema. It's the most important law. And remember again, Jesus answered this when questioned. He said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. This goes back to Deuteronomy. And also, these words which I command thee, thou shalt meditate upon them, and thou shalt bind them as a sign on thy hand, and they shall be and shall move between thy eyes. Again, it goes back to focusing on what we saw with the rabbis. This is a way of bringing your whole self, body and mind, heart, and love with God. Everything you do, give it to God. Everything you want, ask of God. Trust in His providence, trust in His love. Give glory for everything He's already given us in this planet. I find more and more this is what the Marian apparitions, Our Lady, is always getting us back to. It's not from fear, although things like that, messages and secrets and what it could be and chastisements kind of come across as fear. But that's at the end. You can't say for all these centuries, and especially these last 40 years, God hasn't been giving us everything in a time of grace to fall in love with Him, to have a loving relationship with Him in this life, to experience heaven and His love now. But again, we're still here with the sign in the hand and the forehead. And this is building up to, you'll see more of the liturgical worship as you see who's given us a sign in the forehead or the hand first. Is it the AntiChrist or is it God? The focus is always on the microchips. It's always focused on the New World Order, the Antichrist. But no one seems to think about the fact that it goes back to where God had it first. And this should start making you think. Exodus 13. Every firstborn of men thou shalt redeem with a price, and it shall be a sign in thy hand, and as a thing between thy eyes, for a remembrance. Because the Lord has brought us forth out of Egypt by a strong hand. And it shall be as a sign in thy hand, and as a memorial before thy eyes, and the law of the Lord be always in thy mouth, for with a strong hand the Lord has brought thee out of the land of Egypt. Again, giving thanks to everything God done for us, and this is Him forming His church of worship. The final one, 7 days shalt thou eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day shall be the solemnity of the Lord. Unleavened bread is underlined for a reason. So the conclusion would therefore be, these are all forms of worship, liturgical acts of worshipping God. They have God on their mind and in their work. The redemption of the firstborn sons is a liturgical act. It's a memorial where they bless the lentils with the blood of the Lamb. Now pay attention here. The blood of the Lamb was placed over the lentils in a vertical splash, and the doorposts in a horizontal splash with a hyssop branch. A hyssop branch. John highlighted this in his Gospel regarding the passion of Jesus on the cross, when the sour vinegar was placed on the rod to give to Jesus as he hung there, when he says, I thirst. The vertical and the horizontal are the cross, and as we know, the unleavened bread is also a liturgical act, as we know. So if the devil wanted to imitate Christ to the fullest, where do you think he will be doing it? The Catholic Church must be on its guard for these times. Remember that before the Reformation, all the Christians were united in their belief of the true Eucharistic presence of Christ. The Catholic Church is the only Church of Christ still anchored in this tradition and truth. If you recall my last video, the Fatima and Garabandal connections, this is one of the slides that picked up with the chief exorcist of the Vatican, the late Father Gabriel Amorth, who knew St Pio of Pietrelcina, the mystic, the saint, the stigmatist priest. He knew him well enough, and regarding that secret of Fatima, regarding these times, it was basically Padre Pio who says it's Satan who has been introduced to the bosom of the church, and within a very short time will come to rule a false church. This was around about 1960s. And as Father Gabriel says, Padre Pio wasn't worried about the chastisements, wars, epidemics, anything. What worried him greatly was the great apostasy within the church. This is apocalyptic. This is what it's about, is the great apostasy within the church. So the mark of the beast and its false imitation is to mock the liturgy of God. It's not about microchips. It might be the case that these things are definitely in the making, but that's not what St. John's writing about. That is not the most worrying thing. It is the attack of the devil on the Church of Christ directly. So people then would probably turn around and say, well, the other part is what about buying and selling? Well, it's a completely separate thing. It's also a liturgical and spiritual connotation. Remember the parable of the 10 virgins? The wise ones took oil, the foolish ones didn't. They all slumbered and slept. The wise ones with the oil woke up as the bridegroom came and lit their lamps. They were able to meet the bridegroom. The wise ones said to go to those who sell and buy for yourselves. The oil is grace. The wise virgins are those who kept the state of grace in their souls. The foolish ones didn't. Yet they all slumbered and slept. That was the sleep of death. All had to die, whether in the state of grace or not. So when the bridegroom came, it was the resurrection, and the wise ones had the state of grace in their souls. When you're told to go and buy and sell the oil from those who sell, it's the church who gives the oil, the grace, through God's divine plan. So the worship of God is being spoken in the Apocalypse. The signs on the head and forehead are liturgical actions, the worship of God. So when the mark of the beast is introduced, it is something that is opposed to the worship of God. I think again with Medjugorje, that's why she tells us, don't wait for the permanent sign, don't wait for the secrets to unfold, convert now, because by then it will be too late for many. This is the time of love, the time of grace, the time of mercy. The number of the beast, as we know, is 666. Now, why is that the case? Here's a little bit from the Apocalypse. Here is wisdom. He that hath understanding, let him count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and the number of him is 666. Now, it's good to know, even going back to the creation in Genesis, every part of creation had its own day, except for the humans. We, who were the greatest of all creation, made in the image and likeness of God, were created on the sixth day along with the beasts. Why? Because when God rested on the seventh day, he was inviting us to his eternal presence. We stay dumb and ignorant, walking about, eating when we have to, doing whatever we have to, like the beasts, or we enter that eternal presence of God. And it's worthy to note here, as you see, anything to do with sex always seems to be in a devilish, satanic, evil way. So Goliath was 6 cubits high. King Nebuchadnezzar built a gold statue to himself. Pride, false worship of a false idol. and that statue was 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide. But the reason the word wisdom is underlined at the top there refers to King Solomon. Now, why would it be anything to do with King Solomon? How is King Solomon connected to the number 666? Well, it depends on the Bible you look at. For some Bibles, it's the third book of Kings. If you're using the Catholic one, which is normally the Revised Standard Version, it would be 1 Kings 10, verse 14. And there's also another one in 2 Chronicles 9, verse 13. But if you've read them, you'll know in conclusion, therefore, that God commanded 3 things when it came with Solomon. It was, don't multiply your wives, don't multiply your chariots, don't multiply your gold. But yet Solomon had, they reckon, about 700 wives and 300 concubines. The chariots are to do with military power. And then, of course, multiplying of gold. He had all the wealth he could get. Again, that's why it's 666. Now, the reason that is showing up is because multiplying your wives is a sign of perversion. It's a sign of not being pure of heart. For those who are pure of heart shall see God. This is where Solomon fell. The wise Solomon of the world fell in the world. The chariots are all your military power. Then, of course, the multiplying of gold. We're relying on God's providence. Do you notice that in this day and age where the arms race is ready to be back on when the treaties end? Have you noticed now with the latest presidential election, a few other nations are starting to test out their anti-ballistic missile systems? Have you noticed the amount of trillions of dollars for years now that are being constantly printed on paper during these times? And that was before even the pandemic came in. You think the social collapse and economic collapse of what's been warned with Garabandal and other places might be coming closer? Because these 3 things, these 3 principles have been completely ignored and distorted in the world. There's something else that stands out with Solomon that's worthy to note. Here's a picture of Solomon. But let's bring it in with a Marian apparition here, which I think really stands out. Our Lady of Quito, January 21st, 1610, she takes the title of Our Lady of Good Success, and I've covered this in the very first video of this playlist. She did say back in 1610, pointing to a specific time, which is the 19th century and shortly after the 20th century. I'm sure it was shortly after the mid-20th century. That's a typo. During this time, passions would erupt and total corruption of customs, which is morals. For Satan will reign almost completely by means of the Masonic sects. They'll focus principally on children in order to sustain this general corruption. The sacrament of matrimony, attacked and deeply profaned. The sacrament of holy orders will be ridiculed, pressed and despised. These are the words of Our Lady back then in the 1600s. Did you see shortly after the mid-20th century of those passions corrupting in the mid-60s? The fact there's a total corruption of morals in this society now. I was on even the news the other day. If the morals of a society fall, the society eventually implodes in itself. Now that should be making you thinking of a couple of nations right now especially. But certainly, we're talking the Western world for sure. But the other thing I want to stand up here, why is King Solomon and Quito, Ecuador on the same page? Not that I know much about it, but I've read it's come in the odd book here and there when you're reading about these apparitions and the signs of the times. The Masons, the Knights Templar, anything to kind of do with the fact that when the Freemasonry began, they usually say it coming back to the time of the building of the temple. They take it back to the time of Solomon. Now that's as much as I'm going to speak on that, but surely this wise Solomon, who built up his army, who built up his wealth, and who had the perverse relationships with 1,000 women, thus breaking the complete 3 principles God commanded, is surely a good idol to put on the fact that in this modern day and age, the Masons, which stems from his time, are the ones now focusing on the corruption of morals in this modern day society. Look at the secret societies today and their influence in place of education. the control of the family, the news about the church. There's no secret of the infiltration into the church, the communists, but yet the communists are the play child of the Masonry. There's so many things happening at once right now. This should be seriously stood out. Last thing I'll point out in the slide here, it was hard to kind of find this with the different languages. The top line is Greek, the second one is Hebrew, and then putting that into our language to understand its numbers. And as you see in the photograph there, this is a parchment of John's writing. The XIC basically 616. So how's the mark of the beast 666? Now, taking this off from previous seminary studies and putting it together and speaking aloud, as you'll notice in the comparisons with the top and the bottom, when John wrote this, it was at the time of the great Christian persecution under the Nero. And when you add up those numbers of 616, it does spell out Nero Caesar, the way the Nun Resh Vav, Quoth, Samech, and Resh come. But when that was then created to translate, it basically therefore came with 666. It's not that they're wrong or a difference in typing. The Jews didn't have a way of saying, like he's holy or he's holier or he's the holiest. They didn't have the endings like that. So in order to show the opposite of the Holy Trinity of holiness and completion, they had to show the complete threefold of evil, which was 666. So as much as it's came with the Caesars and the persecutions of afar, the times that we're heading in right now are certainly times where it's the incorporation of all the kings of the earth, of all the nations of the earth, and they're making themselves into God. Something similar what Our Lady of Medjugorje says, that mankind has turned his back on God and they're going to believe in their own creator as themselves. And Catherine Emmerich spoke about the time church closures were coming about. Yeah, centuries past, you might relate that back to the Pantheon and different things, but I still can't get away with 200 years to the day she wrote about church closures, a compromise, the church being constantly undermined. And one of those messages was April 12, 1820. You forward that 200 years to the day on April 12, 2020, and it was Easter Sunday. Just under a year ago of this recording, April 12, 2020, 200 years to the day, the churches are closed globally because of the pandemic. Easter Sunday, biggest day of the year we can't worship the Lord. The time of the two popes. Now entering the 40th year of Medjugorje, where Our Lady stopped appearing also in this past year to Mariana on her monthly messages. The things and signs happening within the church, the things that's happening within the world, where it's going to by 2030 is a good anchor. That's the plans for the low carbon emissions, a global reset. So many things are happening, friends. And I think Our Lady of Knock right now is really highlighting something to me. And I think some of the viewers who highlighted, let's look into Knock. I definitely want to look into Knock now because it's the year of St Joseph, leading up to the 150th anniversary from being declared the protector of the Universal Church. In Knock, it is St John, Our Lady, and St Joseph. And it's silent apparitions. The lamb's on the altar. St John standing there with the Apocalypse. We've quickly went through the main points. And now St Joseph, it's his year. Something just strikes me in that silence is how the church is silent and taking what it's taken from governments this very day, this past year, and that's silent. It takes it, it compromises, a compromise in silence. Where is the worship of the Lamb? I think the symbolism in that Knock apparition is worth investigating for sure. And Michael Rodrigue, Father Rodrigue, past year, done a great video on explaining how it's important for our times. In a personal conversation I had briefly of the several times I was in the company of Marino Restrepo, he also once says it's for the future, knock is for the future. No more was said, but I'm starting to make sense of it. I have been focused on Fatima, Akita, Garabandal, Medjugorje. All these things are not coincidences, my dear friends. It really isn't. There's so much happening right now, but as it says, there's nothing to fear. God's in control. God's already won. So we're just going through this ruckus uh, before he gets his head kicked in by Our Lady. Literally. She will stamp her foot on his head. And that's where we're at. So take great comfort. Take pleasure in knowing what side we're on. And keep praying for the church. Keep praying for yourself and your family and your friends. And don't be too focused on debates and arguments on social media and elsewhere. Live the life of Christ. And I know it's easier said than done, but if this year's taught us anything, now is the time of grace. Grab every bit of grace possible that God's given us while we can. It's the most important thing for the events that are soon to come.